Hello and welcome to the 8th season of our Maritime Impact podcast. I'm your host, Eirik Nyhus, Director Environment for Maritime at DNV. I'm joined today by a special guest to discuss the commercial and contractual implications of FuelEU Maritime, my colleague and Head of Sales, Helge Hermundsgård. With entry into force just a few weeks out, there is a dawning realization in the industry that while it may be difficult to fully understand all the wrinkles of legal compliance, commercial implications are even more challenging to master. Helge is the right guy to give us the insights we need. But first, and just to set the scene a bit, let me very quickly recap where we stand when it comes to the regulations. FuelEU Maritime, FEM from now on, is the next regulatory step from the EU taking effect from the 1st of January 2025. FEM applies requirements to the annual greenhouse gas footprint of the energy used on board ships with, at least initially, the same vessel coverage as the ETS, namely cargo and passenger vessels above 5,000 GT. Note the annual aspect. This has commercial and contractual implications as charter parties rarely line up with the annual compliance cycle, meaning that contracts need to deal with how incurred liabilities and assets are handled as charters start and end during the reporting year. In contrast to the ETS, for FEM, the ISM company is a legally responsible party, and it is the ISM company managing the ship at the end of the calendar year that is responsible for legal compliance for the entire year. This is irrespective of how management and charter parties have changed over the calendar year itself. And this is why I have asked Helge to join me today to dig into what this actually means in practice. Welcome, Helge. It's good to have you back. You may not be aware of this, but you are actually the first guest to be on the show for the second time, so think of it as a singular honor.
Thank you.
We want to get going with what I just talked about, the issue of the responsible parties. How do you think about the way legal responsibilities for FEM compliance is defined, versus the commercial reality that different stakeholders actually have to deal with? Because there are certainly other parties than just the legally responsible one that has to think hard about the implications here. I'm thinking owners, I'm thinking charterers, and not only managers. Could you enlighten us a little bit on how you see some of the key issues here?
Yes, of course. I think one of the key here is first look at some of the key role. The responsibility for FuelEU Maritime resides with the DOC company, ISM company. And this is different from ETS, where it is the owner. It might, of course, be the dock company that is responsible for ETS as well, after it has been mandated to them.
Mm-hmm.
However, with FuelEU, you don't have the opportunity to mandate it to anyone else. And here lies a little bit of challenge, because a typical ISM company have little or no impact on the key drivers for what is defining your FuelEU exposure. Really, the fuel that has been used and where the vessel have been trading. So in a way, it's logical that the responsibility and the exposure from this regulation should be transferred. And transferring this in the shipman contract is not necessarily covered as the contract is formed today. It have to be done, but this doesn't really release the dock company and the ISM company from being responsible towards the authorities. So here it's important to define this in the contracts.
Right. So you essentially have this kind of disconnect between being responsible and being having the requisite control of what's happening. And the way I've read the regulation and the way you've read the regulation, I guess, yes, the EU is concerned about the legal compliance side of things, but when it comes to the contractual stuff, that's simply left for business to work out between the different parties, right?
Exactly. And if you read the regulation, that defines the interface between the authority and the regulatory responsible entity, which is the ISM company. There's little or nothing to be found in the regulation about what to do in the commercial contracts between the other players in this maritime value chain.
Mm-hmm. So when you look at the contractual aspects of this, how would you think about what kind of new issues do contracts need to deal with here? What are some of the key problems that we're looking at?
If you take the shipman contract first, The shipman contract here really need to be updated. In an ideal world, before January 1st. However, it's probably not that critical, but it need to be updated. What should be included there is how the owner will be made responsible for FuelEU, how the ship manager should be guaranteed a compensation if there will be additional liability, and also the collaboration model between the DOC company and the owner when, for example, defining and making decision on what should be the compliance measure. Because the different compliance measure might have different costs connected to it.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, that really belongs with the owner. And then you have the commercial contracts. And this, what I've seen so far is that when you look at the different contracts, the different formats, they have different elements with respect to FuelEU Maritime. If you look at the typical voyage contract, the voyage contract is you pay the rate for a specific voyage, and the additional cost for FuelEU Maritime is included in the charter rate.
Right, because it's simple essentially to do that for that one voyage.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely, and the same for a typical contract of affreightment. It's included in the freight rate.
Mm-hmm.
There will, however,
Mm-hmm.
be some voyage charters where there will be need for separate settlements. But if you look at the typical TC contract, where the charterer is deciding where the vessel is trading, what kind of fuel it's using, there will be a need for separate settlement. And then the key part there will, of course, be the compliance balance, which it's called, which is the difference between the required greenhouse gas intensity and the actual greenhouse gas intensity during that period.
Meaning that either you generate compliance units that have a value, or you're actually negative on the compliance side and will have to compensate for that somehow. So that means money can flow either way in these contracts, and I guess.
An interesting part on that matter, Eirik, is that if let's assume that you are the charterer, I am the owner, I've chartered out the vessel to you, and you have been burning biofuel. That produces a surplus. If the charter period is over, the vessel has generated a surplus, you have paid more for the fuel. Would you be willing to give that surplus back again to me, or should I compensate you?
I guess we'll need to have an agreement on that, hopefully up front.
Yeah, and the other way around, if it's a deficit, I would probably want you to compensate me.
Exactly.
And here is one of the topics that is very important to, in a way, agree in the charter parties, and also the compensation from the owner to the charter in case there is a surplus. I think it's a debated topic these days. And one thing that is interesting to see there is also the development in how to do settlements here, which we will see on the new trading platforms that is evolving as we speak. And there might be different opportunities to manage those settlements down the road. So follow what's happening in that part of the market would be very, very interesting.
Now that's interesting, because what we're seeing here is really that there's been a market created almost by almost by accident, in a sense, by the legislative mechanisms that the EU has put in place. So how that's going to evolve is going to be pretty interesting, because with a new commodity, we'll have new stakeholders and people looking for opportunities they didn't see before, I guess. But moving on a little bit here, Helge. When you look at what this means, I would suggest that this probably points to a much greater need for internal control and management in the individual companies, right? Potential issues that used to come with no real price tags are all of a sudden going to start having some meaningful financial consequences.
Absolutely. There will be cost tags to this. There will be implication. I think it's two key dimension here that is important to, in a way, control. And one is on the commercial side towards the external part. It's also important for an owner or an operator to, in a way, follow up their vessels and their fleet. And just to take an example here, it's if you have a vessel that is trading on different charter contracts throughout the year, in order to have good control here, you would need to follow the individual vessel up with respect to how the compliance balance is developing on the individual charter period and on year to date.
So that you actually are able to see what the prognostics are look like when you get towards the end of the legal compliance period, I guess.
Absolutely, and here you will also then have a very interesting feature in the regulation that makes this a little bit more tricky, and that's the redistribution in order to calculate the compliance balance.
You're talking about the redistribution in connection with using lower carbon fuels such as biofuels on the 50% voyages, right?
Absolutely. So if you're using the biofuel on the 50% voyage, you are getting 50% of the benefit if that's the way you are calculating it. But for compliance purposes, you can redistribute that to an 100% exposure and get the full benefit of it.
But if those other redistributed voyages are owned by some other or are under other charter parties, how do you settle that?
This is where the fun begins because you really need to be able to redistribute within the individual charter period and treat that as separate entities. Because one charter, let's say, you were a charter and I was a charter of the same vessel, you produced the surplus and I produced the deficit. You are not willing to compensate or give that away for free to me.
Nope.
I probably have to pay some way. So this makes it complex, but it's good also. And one thing then is to follow up the individual vessel. But if you are an owner and you have a few vessels or maybe many, you need to follow up your fleet. And your fleet might be a compliance pool. So you need to follow up that throughout the year as well. And you need to have the capabilities in a way to also say, well, this is how I'm performed this year to date. If I am a little bit in the deficit, what is my opportunities for getting back on track? So you
Right.
need actually the capabilities to simulate. And what we see today, and we have done it for with many companies these days, and that's to simulate, given how we performed in 2024, how much low carbon fuel do we need in order to be compliant next year? And if you look at the math here, the lower carbon fuel is probably a cheaper option with the current prices in the market than paying the fine. I'm not speculating on the future prices, but it's so important to manage this because when the year is over, it's done and dusted.
Yeah, and I guess that really brings us to another other core issue here because okay, one thing is to have the contracts and the arrangements in place to actually deal with this in the commercial space, but to do that, you got to be at least agree on what kind of data you're looking at. So I guess that brings us right to the issue of data quality, because negotiating contracts, fine, all that can be challenging, especially now with new settlement stuff coming up. But if you don't even have a shared understanding of what the data is that underpins the settlements, I guess you'd be in a world of hurt when it comes to doing the financials at the end of the charter parties, right?
And there you're pinpointing one of the big challenges, Eirik. If you take a value chain of the in the maritime industry where you have a ship manager, an owner, an operator, and a charter, are they using the same data? I think my record from last year was a vessel with 5 different noon reporting systems to 5 different entities. And the only thing I'm for sure knows about that setup is that the data used by one entity is different than the others, even though they have been punched by the same guy on board.
Right. So you got to align this stuff somehow, right?
You need to align it. So what we have seen lately is that establishing let's say a one universe of data that is trusted, and in our world that means verified, so it can be trusted by multiple stakeholder is important. And this sounds difficult and it sounds complex, but really it might be relatively simple. We are working now with a ship owner. They have vessels. They have outsourced their commercial management to someone external business partner. They have put their vessels with different technical managers. And what they have done now is that they're using the noon reports from their business partner and they are then getting these verified and quality assured in the Emission Connect part, and is shared back to the owner for MRV reporting and back to the technical managers for ETS and future FuelEU reporting. And that creates a setting where you are enabling that the data used for the commercial and the business management is one-to-one with the data used for the reporting to the authorities. And this is enabled by, for example, the Veracity platform.
That's interesting because, yes, of course, we know that verification is important for legal compliance, obviously. But what you're telling me really is that this is equal or maybe even more important in a business sense, at least, when it comes to the commercial aspects, because at the end of the day, there's real money riding on these numbers being accurate.
And that's the reason why this is becoming important now. Because when there were no money attached to if you emitted 1 ton or 2 tons of CO2, now it is.
Hmm.
And when there is money involved, there is way more scrutiny on the quality of those data.
Yeah.
And if the data is not consistent, then there will be disputes.
Yeah.
And we all know how long a dispute is taking.
Yeah, that's for sure. We don't want to go there if we can avoid it. Listen, Helge, I'm cognizant of time here, so I don't want to hold you too long. But any other key issues to address? I'm thinking of implications of pooling, for instance, the likelihood that it will become a pretty important tool as we see that biofuel availability may be inadequate to at least satisfy everybody who says they'll be doing biofuel. How do we see this evolve with respect to new service providers, facilitators, etc.?
I think what is happening now, which is important to follow, is the development of trading platforms and trading mechanisms for trading surplus or matching surplus compliance balances with deficit balances. And we will see a lot of evolution in that market going forward. The different players are doing it differently, but a very good advice here is to understand what's happening there. Because one of the challenges with the regulation is that, of course, towards the authority, the compliance object is a vessel year. In the real world, a commercial contract between an owner and a charter rarely starts January 1st and then December 31st. So you need to handle these shorter or longer periods of that year. And some of these trading platforms provide some really interesting features of how to manage that in a very smooth way.
Really interesting times we're getting into here. It does not stop with just regulations being done. It's also how we deal with them in the real world, I guess. Anyway, Helge, thank you so much for joining me today. I believe our audience here has gotten some real food for thought. Hopefully, they also have an increased sense of urgency now that the clock is fast counting down towards the January 1st. And as you said, we are entering an even more complex commercial reality here. So thank you very much for being with me here today, Helge. I really appreciate it. Who knows? Maybe you'll even get on the show a third time. We'll find out.
Maybe.
My key take from our conversation is that while legal compliance may be complex, the commercial and contractual implications are even more so. Dealing with responsibilities, liabilities, and assets in this ever changing interplay between managers, owners, and charterers is going to require new contract structures, and that needs to happen quickly. Remember, while legal compliance checks get going only in 2026 based on reporting of 2025 data, the commercial aspects come into play on January 1st, 2025. Secondly, data really matters. If the managers, owners, and charterers don't have a common agreement on what the real data underpinning contract settlements is, there will be real difficulties and potential litigation. Remember, for FuelEU Maritime, data translates to real money. And finally, to repeat myself ad nauseum, the clock is ticking. For a thorough overview of the FuelEU Maritime regulation, compliance options, and the potential cost impacts of different strategies, I highly recommend the DNV's new FuelEU Maritime white paper. It offers valuable insights, including the commercial implications we've just discussed with Helge. You can download the white paper by visiting our FuelEU Maritime topic page at dnv.com FuelEU-Maritime. The link is in the show notes. Thank you for joining us for this episode. You've been listening to the Maritime Impact Podcast from DNV with me, Eirik Nyhus. It was a real pleasure to have Helge with me today. In our next and final episode of this season, I will be joined by Jakob Granqvist, Vice President Maritime at Gassum, who can give first-hand insights on pooling management and low-carbon fuel supply. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to give us a rating or a review. Thank you for listening.